They said the smell came before the girl ever spoke her first word. Not the ordinary scent of birth or blood, but something deeper, older, like wet earth opened too soon and left to breathe. When her mother collapsed in the holler at dawn, the midwife found the infant still warm, still breathing, while the woman who bore her had already begun to sour, her veins dark as river mud. No one could explain how a living child could carry the stench of decay so completely that even the flies circled and fled. The mountains noticed before the people did. Dogs refused to cross the creek where she was washed. Birds abandoned the trees above the cabin where she slept. By the time the townsfolk realized death lingered in her blood, it was already too late to pretend she was ordinary. Those who held her too long fell ill within days. Those who whispered prayers over her coffin-sized cradle were buried before the prayers could dry on their lips. She grew quietly, watching funerals from the edge of the trees, learning the shape of grief before she learned how to read. The smell followed her like a second shadow, faint in the morning, overwhelming at dusk. She learned to recognize it in others, that subtle shift in the air that meant someone would not see another sunrise. When she smelled it on herself for the first time, she understood why the mountains groaned at night. Old stories surfaced then, dragged up from mouths that had stayed closed for generations. Stories of bloodlines meant to carry burdens, of daughters born to keep something sleeping beneath the roots of Appalachia. The girl listened as the fog thickened and the soil darkened, as the world around her began to rot in sympathy with her pulse. She did not cry. She already knew the truth the mountains were preparing to finish telling, that death was not following her, and never had been. It was waiting inside her, patient as the hills themselves. The girl was found at first light, when the mist still clung low to the Appalachian holler and the trees stood like watchful silhouettes. Her mother lay collapsed beside a narrow footpath, her body twisted as if she had tried to crawl away from something only she could sense. The woman's blood had already begun to darken unnaturally, thick and sluggish, carrying a smell that made the midwife gag when she knelt beside her. It was not the sharp tang of fresh death, but the heavy odor of rot that belonged to things buried too long and brought back too soon. The child, however, was alive. Her chest rose and fell in small, stubborn movements, her skin warm despite the cold ground beneath her. That alone should have been miracle enough, yet the air around the infant was worse than around the corpse, saturated with the same decaying stench, only stronger, as though it pulsed from within her tiny veins. Those who gathered expected the smell to fade once the girl was lifted from her mother's body, but it did not. It clung to her clothes, her hair, her breath. Even when washed in clean creek water, the scent remained, rising again as soon as her skin warmed. Flies hovered uncertainly and then scattered. A mule tied nearby broke its tether and bolted into the trees, screaming as if burned. The men standing closest felt an unease they could not name, a pressure behind the eyes, a sudden certainty that something ancient had gone wrong in the order of things. The mother's face, slack in death, seemed almost relieved, as if whatever burden she carried had finally passed on. There were no wounds on her body, no signs of struggle, no reason she should have died so completely while the child lived so fiercely. When they tried to recall the woman's pregnancy, memories turned slippery. Some swore she had been sick for months, others insisted she had seemed unnaturally strong. No one could remember when her belly had begun to swell, only that it had happened quietly, without celebration or prayer. The midwife crossed herself and whispered that the blood was wrong. She had delivered babies through fevers, famines, and stillbirths, but she had never smelled death on something that had not yet learned how to cry. The girl opened her eyes then, dark and alert, and the smell thickened, spreading through the clearing like fog. It was as if her blood carried the echo of something that had died long ago and refused to stay buried, something that had waited patiently for a living vessel, and in that moment, as the mountains held their breath, it became clear that the child had not simply survived beside death, she had been born from it, carrying its presence quietly, instinctively, as though it belonged there just as much as her heart and breath. It did not take long for the animals to decide what the people could not yet name. When the girl was brought into the cabin at the edge of the holler, the dogs that once slept beneath the porch began to whine and scratch to be let loose. They refused food, refused water, their eyes fixed on the doorway as if something unseen pressed against it from the other side. By the second night, one of them snapped its own leash and ran headlong into the woods, its howls cutting off so abruptly that no one went looking. The remaining dogs lay trembling, muzzles buried beneath their paws, breathing shallow and fast. Chickens stopped laying within days. They huddled together in the far corner of the yard, feathers puffed, heads tucked as though trying to disappear into themselves. When the girl was carried past them, several dropped dead without a sound, their bodies unmarked, their eyes still open. Horses refused the trail that led to the cabin, rearing and foaming at the mouth when forced. Even the mules, stubborn creatures raised on hardship, planted their hooves and would not move forward, no matter how hard they were beaten. The men began to notice how the forest behaved. Deer tracks skirted the property in wide arcs. The creek that ran clean and cold past the cabin went strangely quiet, its frogs vanishing overnight. Once, a black bear wandered too close at dusk, drawn perhaps by curiosity or hunger, only to stop short and rise on its hind legs, sniffing the air. It let out a sound like a cough choked into a whimper before turning and crashing blindly through the underbrush, leaving behind deep gouges in the earth where its claws had lost control. Those who dismissed such things as coincidence found themselves standing alone. The smell that clung to the girl seemed sharper to animals, unbearable in ways human senses could only half perceive. When she cried, livestock panicked, straining against fences until boards splintered and posts came loose. One goat dropped where it stood, legs folding beneath it as if sleep had claimed it all at once. The townsfolk whispered that death recognized its own. A hunter, proud and skeptical, decided fear had gone too far. He brought a hound bred to track wounded prey for miles, certain the animal would prove the rumors false. The moment the dog caught the girl's scent, it froze, ears flattening, tail tucked so tightly it brushed its belly. Then it began to howl, long and broken, before collapsing in the dirt, foam at its mouth, eyes rolling white. The hunter never hunted again. After that, no creature crossed into the girl's presence without consequence. Animals did not merely avoid her, they reacted as though she carried an invisible wound in the world itself, something bleeding into the air, something that signaled an ending they were never meant to witness, and the mountains, long accustomed to the language of beasts, seemed to listen and grow uneasy with them. As the girl grew older, the pattern revealed itself slowly, cruelly, in a way that could no longer be dismissed as misfortune. People who kept their distance remained unharmed, watching from porches and fence lines with narrowed eyes. Those who did not were rarely so lucky. A woman who insisted on bathing the child fell sick within the week, her skin graying as if drained from the inside. A man who carried her across the creek during a flood collapsed days later, coughing up dark fluid that smelled faintly of the same rot that clung to the girl's clothes. Death did not arrive violently at first. It crept in quietly, politely, as though it had been invited and saw no reason to rush. Time seemed to matter. Brief encounters brought headaches, nosebleeds, a lingering weakness that sleep could not cure. Prolonged contact brought funerals. The townsfolk began counting days between touch and burial, whispering numbers as though they were measuring a sickness. 3 days for the midwife. 5 for the preacher who laid hands on the child and prayed too long. 7 for the schoolteacher who insisted she deserved an education and kept her seated at the front of the room. Each death tightened the invisible boundary around the girl, shrinking her world to a narrow circle of empty ground and watching trees. She noticed it before anyone explained it to her. People stepped back when she approached. Hands that once reached out now hovered uncertainly in the air before retreating. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. The smell grew stronger when fear thickened, as if her blood responded to the unspoken truth. She began to measure her presence by the way others breathed, by how their voices faltered when they spoke too close to her face. She learned not to linger, not to sit beside anyone too long, not to sleep under the same roof twice if she could help it. Death followed patterns too precise to ignore. Those already ill declined faster after seeing her. Old injuries reopened. Lingering coughs turned wet and final. Even the young and strong were not spared if they stayed near her long enough. A boy who walked her home every afternoon collapsed in the field before winter ended, his heart simply stopping as though it had been told to do so. His mother's screams echoed through the valley, carrying the accusation no one dared speak aloud. The girl began isolating herself long before she was told to. She slept in the loft, then in the shed, then finally in the woods when the fear inside the cabin became heavier than the cold. She watched from a distance as graves multiplied, each one an unspoken reminder of what proximity to her meant. At night, she smelled death more clearly than ever, not just around others but rising from her own skin, seeping into the ground beneath her feet. By the time the townsfolk openly acknowledged what was happening, the truth felt old, worn smooth by repetition. People did not die because they were weak or unlucky. They died because they stayed. Whatever lived in the girl's blood did not strike randomly or in anger. It waited, patient and inevitable, until closeness turned into connection, until presence became intimacy, and then it claimed what it had been quietly promised all along. He arrived on a mule thin as a fence rail, his coat dusty with road miles and his eyes too bright for a man who claimed to serve the Lord. The townsfolk gathered out of equal parts hope and desperation, drawn by the rumor that he had seen things like this before, things that did not bend to prayer alone. He listened more than he spoke at first, letting the stories spill out in hushed fragments, nodding as though each word confirmed something he already knew. When he finally asked to see the girl, the room went silent, the kind of silence that carries a warning. He did not flinch when the smell reached him. His jaw tightened, his hand closing slowly around the worn Bible at his side. He circled her once, careful not to touch, his lips moving soundlessly as if counting or remembering. Then he said what no one else had dared to shape into language. He told them her blood was marked, not by sin, not by sickness, but by a covenant older than their churches, older than the roads that cut through the mountains. He spoke of a time when faith had not worn names or steeples, when people bargained with the land itself, trading blood for protection, children for silence. The preacher said the mountains remembered those bargains even if the people did not. He claimed certain families were chosen to carry what could not be destroyed, to keep it alive without letting it roam free. The girl, he said, was not cursed by accident. She was born exactly as intended, a vessel shaped by generations of sacrifice and forgetting. The smell was proof, the scent of something sealed too long and still breathing. Some spat at his feet, calling him a liar, a devil in borrowed scripture. Others leaned closer, hungry for meaning that might make the deaths survivable. The preacher warned them that killing the girl would not save them, that breaking the vessel would only loose what it contained. He said the bloodline had thinned, weakened by time and doubt, and that she might be the last strong enough to hold it. When asked what would happen if she failed, he only looked toward the mountains and shook his head. He offered no cure, no ritual that promised safety. Prayer, he said, would not change what was written into bone and breath. The best they could do was distance, respect, and silence, the same tools their ancestors had used before they forgot why. Before leaving, he bent close enough for the girl to hear his whisper. He told her she was carrying something sacred and monstrous in equal measure, something that loved the dark and feared release, and that the longer she lived, the heavier it would grow, pressing outward, testing the walls of her blood for weakness. The realization came to her not as a sudden revelation but as a slow sharpening of the senses, like learning to hear a sound that had always been present beneath the noise of the world. At first, it was only the smell that changed, thickening in certain places, clinging to certain people more than others. She noticed it around the old before they fell, around the sick before their fevers broke or claimed them. It was stronger at night, carried on the cool air, seeping into her lungs until she could taste it on her tongue. She began to associate it with endings, with the quiet moments just before something slipped beyond reach. The first time she understood what it meant, she was sitting at the edge of the creek, watching the water move around stones worn smooth by decades of passage. A man passed her on the trail, nodded politely, and kept walking. As he drew closer, the smell rose suddenly, sharp and undeniable, wrapping around him like a second skin. It made her stomach twist with a certainty she could not yet explain. 3 days later, word reached her that he had been found dead in his sleep. His heart stopped without warning. She counted backward, aligning the memory of the scent with the moment of his death, and felt something inside her settle into place. After that, the pattern repeated too often to ignore. The smell would arrive days ahead of time, faint at first, then growing heavier as the moment drew near. She could tell how close death was by its strength, how tightly it clung to a person's breath or clothes. Sometimes she tried to warn them, fumbling for words that would not sound like madness, but fear always reached their faces before understanding could. Others she avoided entirely, stepping off paths, hiding in the trees, unwilling to be present for something she could not stop. What frightened her most was when the smell turned inward. There were mornings she woke with it thick in her own hair, her own skin, so strong it made her eyes water. On those days, she moved carefully, as if sudden motion might crack something fragile inside her. She listened to her heartbeat, slow and steady, wondering how something so alive could carry such an unmistakable signal of ending. The preacher's words returned to her then, about vessels and burdens, about things held rather than healed. She began to understand that death was not merely following her, it was speaking to her, announcing itself through her blood. The scent was a language, and she was fluent without ever choosing to be. Each time she recognized it, the knowledge carved deeper into her, isolating her further from those who could still live unaware. She learned the cruel mercy of foresight, the weight of knowing without the power to change what was coming, and in that knowledge, she felt herself drifting closer to whatever waited inside her, the thing that knew death not as an enemy but as an inevitable companion that had always been there, patient and familiar. She found the journal by accident, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the abandoned cabin where she sometimes slept to avoid bringing her presence too close to others. The wood creaked differently there, hollow in a way that drew her attention, and when she pried it up she discovered a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, stiff with age and darkened by old stains. The smell rose immediately, familiar and intimate, stronger than anything she had encountered outside her own skin. Her hands trembled as she opened it, not from fear but from recognition, as if her blood already knew what the pages would reveal. The writing was cramped and uneven, passed down through generations, each hand slightly different but bound by the same urgency. Names repeated across decades, always mothers and daughters, rarely sons, and beside many of them were dates that ended abruptly. The journal spoke of a lineage chosen not by grace but by necessity, a family tasked with holding something that could not be killed without consequence. It described an event so old it had blurred into myth, when the mountains themselves were wounded, when something rose from the depths that threatened to rot the land from within. The people had not defeated it. They had contained it, sealing it into blood, teaching it to sleep inside flesh. Each generation weakened the seal just a little more. Faith faltered, rituals shortened, warnings softened into superstition. The journal told of daughters who fled, who tried to live ordinary lives, and of what followed them when they failed. Crops died. Rivers turned foul. Sickness spread without pattern. Always, the solution was the same, brutal and quiet, restoring the burden to the bloodline before the land collapsed entirely. The girl read until the words blurred, understanding now why her mother's face in death had looked relieved rather than afraid. One passage, written in ink so faded it was nearly invisible, explained the smell. It was not decay but pressure, the presence of something pressed too tightly into living vessels, leaking through in small, unavoidable ways. The blood carried it, fed it, kept it dormant, but never erased it. The journal warned that when the last vessel weakened beyond endurance, the containment would fail, and the thing bound within would return to the mountains fully awake. By the final pages, the truth became unavoidable. There were no successors listed after her mother's name. No sisters. No daughters yet unborn. The bloodline had narrowed to a single thread, and she was standing at its end. The journal did not speak of salvation or escape, only responsibility, written over and over in different hands as if repetition might make it easier to bear. She closed the book slowly, feeling the weight of it settle into her chest, understanding that she had never been meant to survive by chance, and that her life had been shaped from the beginning not to be lived freely, but to serve as a living boundary between the world and something that should never be allowed to cross it. The changes in the mountains did not arrive all at once. They crept in gradually, subtle enough at first that only those who had lived there their entire lives sensed something was wrong. Streams that once ran clear developed a dull, metallic taste, their surfaces filmed with an unnatural sheen that caught the light like oil. Fish floated belly up along the banks, unmarked and intact, as though life had simply loosened its grip on them. The soil in the low fields darkened beyond the richness farmers prized, turning heavy and sour, clinging to boots and tools as if unwilling to be shaken loose. Fog began to linger where it once burned away by mid-morning. It pooled in the hollows and refused to rise, swallowing fences, trees, and sometimes entire cabins until they seemed to dissolve into nothing. Sounds traveled strangely through it. A voice shouted from a ridge arrived muffled and warped, while the snap of a branch nearby sounded distant and hollow. People complained of headaches, of a pressure behind the eyes that worsened the longer they stayed outdoors. At night, the fog glowed faintly under the moon, reflecting light in a way no one could explain. Plants responded as if confused about whether to grow or decay. Leaves yellowed too early, then refused to fall, hanging limp on branches well into winter. Roots pushed upward through the soil, exposed and twisting, as though the earth itself were rejecting what it held. Gardens failed in uneven patches, one row thriving while the next rotted into black sludge. Livestock grew thin no matter how much they were fed, their ribs showing beneath dull coats, their breath carrying a faint echo of the same smell that followed the girl. People began connecting these changes to her presence, even if they did not speak it aloud. The land seemed to react to her movements. When she stayed in one place too long, the ground nearby softened and darkened. When she left, it took weeks for things to return to something resembling normal. She felt it under her feet, a subtle vibration in the earth, as if something below was shifting, testing, pushing upward in response to her heartbeat. The journal's warnings echoed in her mind. Containment was not passive. It required strength, balance, constant pressure applied from within. As she weakened under the weight of isolation and fear, the mountains reflected that strain. Cracks appeared in stone faces long thought stable. Old mine entrances collapsed without warning. Trees fell in calm weather, their roots brittle and blackened, snapping like dry bones. The elders whispered that the land was sick, though none could agree on the illness. They burned sage, said prayers, and left offerings at places long forgotten, but the changes continued. The girl watched the fog roll in thicker each evening, smelled the rot growing heavier on the wind, and understood with a clarity that frightened her that the mountains were not simply dying. They were responding. Something beneath them was stirring, stretching against the limits placed upon it, and the world above was beginning to show the strain of holding it back just a little longer. The realization came quietly at first, a certainty that settled over her like the fog in the holler, filling every corner of her mind with a weight she could not shake. She was the last, the final thread of a bloodline that had stretched through generations, each mother passing on a burden she could barely name. The mountains had shifted around her all her life, the streams gone sour, the soil blackened, the fog thickened, and now it became clear why. The curse that had slept in secret, bound by generations of vessels, had found its final anchor in her. There were no sisters to carry it forward, no distant cousins marked by the same scent. She alone bore the full measure of what had been carefully contained for centuries. The knowledge was both terrifying and intimate. She felt it in her pulse, in the subtle rhythm of her heartbeat that seemed to echo the mountains themselves. The air around her thickened at times, carrying the faint iron tang of blood and something older, heavier, something patient and immovable. Animals continued to avoid her, their instincts sharpened, their fear instinctual. People stayed away, and when they could not, illness or death followed, a silent confirmation of what she had begun to understand. The curse was not simply in her blood, it was her blood. She tested it cautiously, small experiments born of fear and necessity. She reached out to touch a fallen bird, its body cold and stiff within moments. She watched a neighbor's fever deepen when she lingered near the doorway. Each confirmation was a knife, carving the truth into her, and yet there was clarity in it, a structure to the chaos she had long endured. This was why the streams blackened when she walked past, why the fog refused to lift, why the soil rebelled against the roots of crops. The mountains themselves were reacting to her presence, to the living embodiment of what had been carefully contained for generations. With understanding came isolation, both chosen and enforced. She withdrew to the woods, to the high ridges where she could see the holler stretch below and feel the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. Here she could measure herself against the mountains, understand her place in the balance, and confront the weight of inevitability. Nights were hardest, when the smell of death rose from her skin and mingled with the mist, and she knew it was strongest there, in the quiet hours when the world forgot to look. She realized she was the hinge between what had been and what might come. The curse slumbered quietly, tethered to her life, waiting for her to falter. Every breath she took carried it, every heartbeat reinforced its hold. In her veins flowed the final boundary between the mountains and the world beyond, and she understood at last that she was not just marked by fate, she was the last living vessel holding something that had been too dangerous, too ancient, and too insistent to release until she allowed it, and she could feel the patient weight of that responsibility pressing down, demanding vigilance, demanding survival. The arrival of outsiders was subtle at first, though their presence carried an unnatural tension that the girl could smell long before she saw them. They came not as neighbors, not as travelers passing through, but with a purpose that bent the air around them, drawing attention even in the fog-draped hollows. Men and women who spoke little, whose eyes lingered too long on her, whose hands twitched near weapons or tools that seemed out of place. They claimed to seek knowledge, to offer help, or to investigate the strange deaths that had begun to ripple through the mountains, but the girl understood their intent almost immediately. They were predators in another language, hunters of the unnatural, and their curiosity carried the cold precision of danger. At first, the townsfolk tolerated them cautiously, hoping outsiders might provide insight or deliverance. But the girl knew better. She felt it in the air, the way the ground under their feet seemed to bristle, the subtle pull of the mountains themselves, as if the land recognized the threat before the people did. The outsiders lingered near the edges of the hollow, watching, listening, taking notes, and occasionally stepping too close for comfort. Livestock that had long avoided her reacted violently when they approached, and the girl realized she could not remain passive. The curse within her was patient, yes, but it was not inert, and the intruder's presence disturbed the delicate balance she had maintained all her life. They attempted contact. One tried to hold her hand, claiming trust and reassurance, only to stumble backward moments later, coughing and wheezing as the invisible weight of what she carried pressed outward. Another attempted to corner her near the creek, insisting she show them the source of the problem, and the fog thickened in response, curling around trees and water, twisting light until their vision failed. Each failure of the outsiders confirmed the truth she had long known: their aim was not understanding, but control or destruction, and either path threatened to undo the careful containment that had kept the mountains from rotting entirely. She observed them from the ridges and the hollowed trees, learning their patterns, watching for moments of weakness. They had tools, knowledge, and persistence, but she had the blood, the bond to the mountains, and the patience of something older than fear. The journals of her ancestors echoed in her mind, reminding her that every generation had faced threats, human or otherwise, and that the weight of containment was heavier than any single hand could wield. And yet, as she watched the outsider's determination harden, she realized the stakes had grown higher. Failure would not only end her life but release what had been carefully bound for centuries. The mountains themselves seemed to pulse in warning, wind rising sharply, fog curling like fingers through the trees, and the girl understood that she was standing at a critical edge. Every choice mattered, every hesitation could cost the hollow, the streams, the forests, the very air around her. They had come seeking her, seeking to exploit or destroy her, and she could feel the presence of what she carried reacting, alert and patient, waiting for the moment when the human reckoning would either falter or break entirely. The weight of the decision pressed on her more heavily than anything she had ever known. She had carried the curse in her blood since the first moments of life, had watched the mountains react to her presence, had seen the slow, inevitable consequences of proximity as death brushed against those around her. Now, with outsiders pressing in, with the land itself whispering warnings she could feel through the soles of her feet, the choice became unavoidable. She could end her own life, taking the curse with her, burying it finally in the silence of her absence, or she could live and risk unleashing the full power of what had been contained, letting the hollow, the forests, and the mountains themselves rot beneath the strain. She thought of the townsfolk, of the few who had shown kindness despite the fear in their eyes. To die might save them, might spare them further illness, suffering, or death. And yet, the curse did not rest quietly even in that scenario. There were echoes, remnants that might linger, and she wondered whether ending her own life could truly guarantee containment. The thought alone made her shiver, the pull of inevitability pressing at her chest like stone. To live meant carrying the burden, balancing it carefully against every step she took, every breath she exhaled. She could not touch, could not linger, could not allow ordinary closeness without consequences. Yet living also meant the mountains would remain intact, streams might recover slowly, the soil might regain a semblance of normalcy, and the hollow could endure. It meant endless vigilance, isolation, and the constant, gnawing awareness that any misstep could unravel centuries of careful control. The thought of that responsibility, eternal and relentless, was almost as heavy as the curse itself. She walked the ridges at dawn, feeling the pulse of the land beneath her feet. Mist curled around the trees and hugged the creeks, whispering the same truth she had always known: she was the